Hey Rock and Metal Guardians, it's Dane. Welcome back to the channel. Today, instead of reviewing a CD, I want to review this book, How Rush Created Progressive Hard Rock's Greatest Record, Moving Pictures by Will Romano. I picked it up about a month ago, and it took about three and a half days to read it. I didn't even know this was a thing. It came out in 2022, so let's jump right in. Romano's central thesis is Rush's songs are quote-unquote cinematic or multi-sensory. Essentially what he's saying is that Rush's songs are musical movies. He traces a history throughout the first half of Rush's catalog from Fly By Night through and including Permanent Waves before he gets to Moving Pictures. And the reason he does that is to show a pattern that with Moving Pictures, that's not where the band started doing this musical movie cinematic thing. It's been there all along since Pert joined the band. So he discusses the cinematic elements of so many songs in that front half of the catalog, like I said. Essentially what he's saying is that these albums paved the way for Moving Pictures in so many ways, excuse me. Again, Moving Pictures for so many of us in our estimation being the zenith of Rush's career. Now, before he does any of this, he gives a nice background to progressive rock in general, to set the tone, if you will. He talks also about, as Martin Popoff did in his book Anthem, the first of three of his biographical trilogy of the band, talking about the formation of the band. And what's interesting is that there are some things in this book that weren't in Martin's book. And that's no knock to Martin whatsoever. Martin Popoff's my favorite critic of all time. But I just found it interesting that there are a few more details in here so in essentially what I'm saying, it's cool because I learned something more about the band and its formation. Both books talk about how at one point Geddy's out of the band and he has his own band. He's competing with, Alex's band. And then now all of a sudden Geddy's back in. These are in both books, as I said, but there's some other details I was like, wow, I didn't know this, so it's kind of cool. Romano does talk about John Rutsey and the first album a little bit, but not much. But he does a nice job of focusing on that bit of information that is so important to the background and history of Rush. So the background to progressive rock and the formation of the band is important to setting up where he's going in his central thesis. So essentially what we have here is that Romano is talking about all the things that make up a record. He's talking about the theme of the songs, what the meaning and lessons are behind the lyrics, so the purpose of the lyrics, right, that Pert has given us, and of course Alex and Lifeson when they chime in lyrically too. The storylines of the songs that have stories. The production and engineering techniques, the studios involved, for example, a studio, the tracking, the multi-tracking, the gear and effects, for example, Alex switching from the Gibson to the Strat, time signature changes, chords, keys, a lot of technical stuff, overdubs, arpeggios, what chord is being played, what key, as I said, all these things. So Romano's going into great detail, and it's quite enjoyable because he does that. And he also talks about why all this makes Rush so appealing. So I'm not going to read much to you, but I do want to read something I found quite interesting. One of his sources, Macan, also talked about how British progressive rock at its pinnacle, quote, brings forth a new tonality, never before heard in either rock or classical music. In Rush's case, the two styles could boil down to hard rock and prog with classical flourishes. And that's important. And I mentioned some of that in my last Friday's episode, Why Progressive Rock Matters, so I thought that was very interesting. Why is Rush so appealing? That's only one of the things he talks about, right? Throughout the book, he talks about what makes Rush so darn appealing. At the center of the book is when he gets into his very extensive discussion of Moving Pictures, song by song, nice, detailed, and great descriptions of all the things that I mentioned already. The production, the studios, as you know, it was recorded like Permanent Waves, Le Studio, the trials and tribulations, the difficulties in trying to get something down, miking the drums, whatever it may be, dealing with the amplifier and the engineering and transferring something from tape to something else and all that stuff that goes on. How and where recorded, As I said, the joys and struggles, the cinematic aspects, of course, of the songs. Again, he goes through one song at a time in great detail. All the things, notes, chords, key, time signature changes, all of that, as I said. Story, theme. Okay? Now, some highlights about the book. For me personally, when he talks about Les Studio, both for permanent waves, but especially for moving pictures, I just love that history of the studio. For example, we all know, most of us, the story of them playing out in the snow while they're not recording, having friends over, and just the relaxing atmosphere that Les Studio gave them for those 2 albums. And then he also talks about, I don't want to give anything away here, the fun and what went through to making the people angry, the angry mob at the beginning of Witch Hunt. So things like that are quite nice and cool. One of the other highlights, perhaps the one that I enjoyed reading the most, is how Getty has to step into an actor's role for the lyrics that Pert writes. For example, we know the biographical point behind Limelight, how timid Pert was. I can't pretend a stranger is a long-awaited friend. That whole thing, not coming to the meet and greets and that sort of thing. And so what Getty has to do is step into Pert's shoes and become Pert for that song. And another example is 2112. Getty has to play the role of both the priest's anger towards the protagonist, and he has to play the protagonist as well. So all this was quite thought-provoking. This book is amazingly thought-provoking about Rush's history and career and artistry, if you will. Also, a highlight of the book, how Romano goes over the theme of nonconformity that permeates all of moving pictures, track by track, well, with the exception of YYZ. But even then, musically, you could argue it's about nonconformity. I think he touches upon that a little bit. He also talks about he also discusses what went into the production of the artwork on the front and back, and who's this person standing here, and why these pictures or paintings were chosen, like Joan of Arc burning at the stake, and that makes us think of Witch Hunt, right? And the fun and that went into that kind of thing. He talks about the Exit Stage Left tour a little bit, and some pages are dedicated towards the post-moving pictures period of Rush. And that's important because, like I said, this book is about moving pictures, but it's also about the whole history of the band. So in a way, it's about album to album. Now, there's a couple of things I also want to read that I was glad that Romano brought up. And that is tied to what I said about post-moving pictures. Pert remarked once that freedom and responsibility are preferable to reliance on a machine. If this is the case, how could Rush have roamed so far from their roots, allowing the very framework of their music to be designed by programmable devices? Did Rush become victims of their own pursuit of technology? Opinions seem divided. And then he goes into detail about divided opinions. And then finally, the last thing I'll read from you. Moving pictures laid the groundwork for these and others, but also benefited from the special X factor: time, place, peak talent, production, and material. With moving pictures, the trio successfully underlined their hard rock roots, but also applied keyboard technology without sacrificing aggressiveness. It would be difficult to make that claim about any other record released after Moving Pictures. It was and is the epitome of equilibrium. And so what Romano does is do what so many of us Rush fans have done throughout the years, is question what happened after Moving Pictures. So, for example, we all know, if you're a Rush fan, we all know that Pert talked about how it's Moving Pictures where they became Rush. Okay, great. But that went away after Moving Pictures. So we think about that. So many of us have, issues with some of their post-Moving Pictures. I like a lot of the post stuff, but I don't enjoy all of it. And so he brings that question up to make you think about that sort of thing. So I thought that quite... And again, why I like to read, one of the reasons is thought-provoking issues, and so that's one of them. The book does end with some reminiscences about Neil. And I thought that was a perfect, I don't want to say too much about that, but I thought that was a perfect way to end his discussion of the band and focusing, the losing of Neil, the tragedy that was that. And it's sad, but I find it necessary that he ends, because in ending it on that note, it's a nice reminder of all the great things that Neil did with the band. And so it pulls at our heartstrings, and again, thought-provoking and all of that. It's a nice touch, essentially, is what I'm saying. So overall, I will rate this book as fantastic. However, there's a small caveat. Early on, there's quite a few typos, and as an English teacher, I was a little annoyed by that. For example, there are places where a word is left out, like an article that you need to, and then there's places where the article's there, but there's another word which throws off the meaning and understanding. What are you trying? So you have to reread it. Oh, this word needs to be dropped. So there's an extra word there. It might be two articles of that. So that's a very minor, nitpicky thing. But I highly recommend that if you're a Rush fan, get this if you can. It'll be worth your time and effort. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.